Hello, folks. Good to be with you again. I have to be reminded that every week the hope is that there are new people there as well. So my name is John Patrick. I'm a retired professor of biochemistry and pediatrics who also taught ethics and humanities and history in other contexts. So I've wandered around the academic world, enjoyed it. It's a great life. You're made for it. And then students pulled me out of that world into the world of, I suppose one could say, apologetics, but simply talking about meaning, really. Ethics, culture, faith, and public policy, and how we need to get them all on the same square. Now, what I'm going to talk about this morning is, I'm still searching for the right words for it, but basically, so many young people now have had the top level of their life cut off, and so they're incapable of certain important things, and they're being reduced to animals, and that's frightening for all of us. So if that sounds a bit outrageous, you better leave now, but you may be coping with it in one way or another. So what has got lost? I mean, the students told me years ago, and it took me a long while, it was not an uncommon event for a student afterwards to say, "You assume a bit too much about us. We never knew the world that you knew. So you need to talk about it a bit more so that we can understand what is possible." So I've been doing that over the years, and astonishing to meet people who heard that kind of talk for the first time, and it was from me. It shouldn't be like that. It should be standard practice, so to speak, in every church. One of my favorite quotations is from Milton, and he says this: "Where there is a great desire to know, there of necessity there must be much argument, because argument amongst good men," and he includes women, "is but knowledge in the making." When did you last, at the end of Sunday morning, if you go to church, did you hear a serious discussion of the sermon, or indeed of any issue where what was being talked about was going to cause division at some level, but it's necessary division, where we are all brothers and sisters if we believe, and so we have to sort out the differences and what they're all about and what we do with them. Now, the evangelical solution, and I'm an evangelical Christian in many ways, although I worship in a liturgical church, is to focus on one verse: "You're saved by grace through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God." And that is all true. But it doesn't stand alone. That's the essential starting point. All the epistles are about growing your mind. So I want to open this up a little bit, if I can. What are the things the young people have lost that I had? Well, one of them is instant gratification. Delayed gratification was the norm. That's what growing up was about. I got my first bike that wasn't put together from bits and pieces when I was 11 because I passed the 11 plus exam. Nothing could be assumed in that direction, except at Christmas, and that's all I cared about. If I got a couple of new books I wanted to read, I was happy. I was a bit of a nerd in some ways, but I rode my bike all over Europe, so not entirely a nerd. Didn't think about it as being anything extraordinary. But of course, in actual fact, it was. So the idea of delayed gratification was built into the church in which I lived. "Here we have no abiding city, but we seek a city whose builder and maker in God," was a kind of subtext to life. And of course, when I ended up spending a lot of time with very underprivileged children, either through malnutrition in the developing world or serious metabolic or genetic diseases in this, there is no solution to that kind of tragedy, not solution in terms of justice, if this life is all we have. There's no way. There are half a dozen syndromes I couldn't cope with it. If I had a child like that, it would have to go into institutional care because it would be impossible, I think. But then you never know what God can do. And I wasn't tested in that way. Of course, Down syndrome children, they normally become the focus of the family and they civilize the family in so many ways. In fact, handicapped children do this a lot. There's no middle ground. They either make families or they break them in many ways. The middle ground is largely unoccupied. So the modern world wants their pleasures now, and that makes them suckers for things like social media with nastiness going on in every direction, and a lot of it about pseudo instant gratification. The worst of all being, of course, sexuality. And once you separate sexuality from marriage and family, promiscuity is inevitable. I was listening to a talk on trigonometry, and I've forgotten the name of the young woman doing it, but she was young by my standards. And she just said out straight up in front in this area, she said, well, by far and away the most promiscuous people are males, particularly homosexuals. They are orders of magnitude more promiscuous than any other group. And she's quite right. And that means they are a major source of the spread of sexually transmitted disease. That's just true. It's not open to argument. That's when sex is disconjoined from what it's clearly biologically made for, and also, I would say, spiritually made for. We've also moved steadily into the primacy of feeling over thought, especially moral thought. Ought was a common word in my growing up world, and the ought for working class kids came from school, but not from the teachers, but from the fact that the British were smart enough, and so was North Americans until the 60s, to realize that the central book for the society was the Bible. And in a working class environment, I didn't learn this till the last year or two. I knew it and I'd never thought about it. But there were no discussions of ethics. Ethics didn't even occur in medical school until, the 1980s. We knew what we ought to do in the way that Lewis describes in the first chapter of Mere Christianity, but also because we actually inhabited a common Judeo-Christian story. And it is that story that made the Western world possible. It's got nothing to do with race at all. Absolutely nothing. But it's Jews and Christians through whom, for whatever reason, God has chosen to take the story that led to the explosion of development from basically the 14th century to today. I mean, the creation of wealth was a concept that didn't happen for a long, long while. I didn't really begin to seriously understand it till I read Niall Ferguson's Civilization. I've watched him and been interested in him. He had his own television program in England. One very smart man from his grandparents lived in the Gorbals, the poor part of Glasgow. But when he started his book Civilization, he opens with what he calls the apps of civilization. And they were boring. All the things that you would expect, a stable political system, democracy, stable currency, all those kinds of things, and what lies underneath them. But I knew he was a standard liberal at that time. He taught at both Oxford and Harvard. He's now at the Hoover Institute on Stanford campus, but very much not Stanford in ethos. And I'd realized he was struggling in terms of how you give an honest account of how development happened. And in the last year or so, he says, I'm now a somewhat reluctant Christian. I go to church and I pray. He's not alone. There are a lot of smart people saying, we can't manage without God. And the working class had learned all the basics at school, because not by propaganda, they simply read the Bible. And the story went into their souls. Children have receptors for stories, and they even have receptors for good stories that are better than stories that are bad. By definition, of course, at one level. Just an example, I mean, my mother died of Alzheimer's, but the last letter she understood came from Canada, and she was in Birmingham in England. And the address on the envelope, some of you may have heard this story before, but it bears retelling, was, "Mr. Postman, please, if you can, deliver this letter to Mrs. Patrick, who used to teach a Sunday school in the Scouts hut opposite the Man in the Moon in West Heath," which is on the, as you can guess, the southwestern edge of Birmingham. And they delivered it. And it was from a girl who'd gone to the Sunday school my mother taught for 35 years, on her own, without a break, except for 2 weeks in the summer for a holiday. And she had up to 50 kids in that room, aged between sort of 5 and 12 or 13. And she never had any discipline problems because she loved the children and they knew it. And she could sing, and she could get them to sing, and she was a storyteller. So she had the only prerequisites there are for a good teacher, which can't be found in the Faculty of Education. Good teachers are made from people who have two loves, a love of the pupil and a love of the subject, in her case, the Bible. This girl wrote her because she'd got married and gone to Canada. And she went to Calgary, which is probably the most church-going city in Canada of that size. And her neighbours invited them to church, and they went. And within a few weeks, she got converted. And then she realized she was like a ripe apple waiting to be picked, because she knew all the stories, all the vocabularies, which she learnt from the few years she spent in my mother's Sunday school. And bless her, she wrote that letter to thank her. That was the last communication from the outside world that my mother responded to with a smile. That's beautiful. That's perfect. That's what the great story does. And it's not there anymore, because we become biblically illiterate because the secularists have decided to dominate us with absolutely no ground. Now, what I'm already getting off track, but that's all right. I am intending to talk about Lewis's Abolition of Man, but I'll talk about the first chapter now, because he understood what was happening to us way back in the time of the Second World War. The Abolition of Man started off as 3 lectures given during the war. It was only published later. Mere Christianity started off as talks to the BBC, and they ended up with 4 series because they were so possible. I mean, read Mere Christianity and ask yourself, can you imagine my society at the moment listening to that in such a way that the major state broadcaster said, we need more of this? Because it was the time of the Second World War. What's interesting is he begins the Abolition of Man with a discussion of the nature of objective values. Can they be defended? Are they real? Now, anybody who says to you, as they will in any university, I feel that, and I'm supposed to bend the knee. I don't, of course, but most people do. You mustn't trample on anybody else's feelings. No, I don't trample, but I do try and point out that they might be wrong. And that's what we should do. And not to do that, if in fact I'm right and they are wrong, then the best thing that can happen to them is for them to change their way of looking at things. That's what Lewis is doing in the first chapter. Amazingly, most people can't get through the first chapter, but a little help might get you through it. He is talking about a book that was published about that time, The title of the book was a giveaway because it was called. It was the real Green Book was a book that had the title "The Control of Language." My goodness, he was ahead. They were ahead of the time too, weren't they? But they're admitting they were interested in power. They wanted to control language by the title, and they turned their classes obviously into propaganda, not teaching people how to write well and what is the difference between a good sentence and a bad one apart from grammar, what's the next step up, etc., etc. Without realizing, they shoot themselves in the foot in the first chapter because it opens with an account of two people looking at a waterfall, and one says that it is beautiful. The other says it is sublime. And Coleridge comments that sublime is the better word. What's he mean? If, as the authors of the Green Book that Lewis is attacking were right, everything is just a social construct. This is not new. This has been around on and off in various ways for a long while. And if it's a social contract, then it's entirely up to you what you say. There's no real value out there. Except, of course, their statement. I mean, they shoot themselves in the foot, presumably in writing that. And they want you to believe they're telling the truth. But the truth they're telling you is that there is no truth other than physical facts. But they're not talking about physical facts. And this happens to us again and again and again. And Lewis is pointing out, he doesn't put it in quite those terms, but if they are right, if the world that rules us is right, then we are just animals. Animals have no value system. They are merely responding to their instincts, according to Darwin. If you want more than that, you may have to ask God whether he's done a bit more than that. The factual world is dominated by, or was until recently, it's cracking in various places now, dominated by the Darwinian model. And Lewis understood that. But of course, these teachers would not have any insight. You get this all the while. People avoiding questions, not realizing, okay, I won't engage with that. And in the process, they're bending the knee to their own feelings, which is a recipe for the breakdown of society as a whole. You can't go that way. It will destroy you. We need something beyond that. One of the most important books of the last 50 years was called After Virtue, The Death of Virtue. We now talk quite often about the post-Christian world. Hopefully that is not true. Certainly many parts of the Muslim world, particularly the difficult places like Iran, are leaving Islam at an incredible rate. Some people say there are millions who have left since the Ayatollahs took over in Iran. They don't say much in public because they might get murdered for it, but if they go to the mosque, they go just so people won't get mad with them. But they're not even going. They're closing down mosques because there's nobody there. There are multiple stories. You simply go on YouTube and put in conversions to Christianity from Islam and see what you get. It's amazing. Because it didn't answer the questions. So the big questions that every student deep down recognizes they need to answer when it's put to them have never been taught to them in high school, not been taught to them in church. I love expository teaching in church, but we need to do more nowadays. We've got to do more for the young people, and it's not playing table tennis and having cookies, You've got to feed their minds. And I learned many years ago that there's a market for this, but I didn't take it seriously. When our children were growing up and we came to Canada, they were at that stage? 5, 7, 9, 11, something like that. And we joined a little church near us. We couldn't find the church we were used to, but this was one that believed the Bible was true and that God was interested in us and he loved us. And they had a youth group, but it was sort of like advanced childcare, had no content. And they needed people to do it because the ones who'd been doing it said, I've done my share. So Sally and I took it on. And I mean, we hired the gym which was just down the street, for 3/4 of an hour to start off with, and they could work off some energy there. And then we came back and had cookies and a drink, and then I talked to them, usually starting from the Bible. But I had an agenda, what I thought they needed to understand. And here are the questions which I have used over the years. Nobody knows their origin. Thoughtful people have expressed them in one way or another since the beginning of any form of writing. They are these. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Those are pretty fundamental questions. It's really 3 layers. Those are fundamental as anyone can see. The next 3 are the very practical ones. How do I deal with death, particularly my own? How do I deal with suffering? Again, particularly my own. How can I believe in justice? What is required for a justice system? And the third 3 are, what can I know with a degree of certainty? Because that will determine what I ought to do. In other words, it would determine my ethics. So it's belief, knowledge, and ethics. Now, the first time I mentioned those in a lecture in a university was at McGill, currently having all sorts of nonsense going on. And when I got back to Ottawa, there were a couple of emails, if my memory serves me right, it may have been more, asking where those questions came from, because they'd never heard them before. They were one of the best universities in Canada. And, of course, this is true anywhere in the Western world. Those 9 questions, which can be used as a test of any education system. If you haven't got some means to begin to engage with those questions by the time you're, shall we say, 18 or 19, then the education system has failed you on purely academic grounds. I mean, it is undeniable that those questions are important. They will determine what kind of citizen you become, depending on the answer you give. And if politicians are really interested in a better society, they would insist that they be taught. But of course, they have no interest in a better society. They just want to win the next election in most cases, which is very cynical of me, but the evidence appears to be somewhat overwhelming. Not entirely, there's hope. So those questions mattered. Lewis knew what they were. The other book the one that people read, because it's easier to read than The Abolition of Man, is Mere Christianity, and it deals with those kinds of questions too. Lewis is good at that. The best, probably, in the last 100 years or so. So, the students that come to university now don't have that level cut off. That's why Peterson intuitively understands this and has his regular Monday thing on Mondays of meaning. He knows that you've got to reach that in some way. And Solzhenitsyn understood. I was amazed that Peterson hadn't read Solzhenitsyn when I first met him. The famous line, "Bless you, prison, for coming into my life." Because he discovered that the real division doesn't lie between men, but within men. Do we respond to what we truly know we ought to do? Or do we go the hedonistic way and just do it? The Nike ad, as one at the moment. But it has consequences. And that's where the pushback is beginning to appear. That within my family now, standing at 49, we have no divorce. Only in the grandchild level are some flirting, as we all did. I mean, this is not new, with other than the traditional way of finding a spouse, marrying and having children, which is not the norm. But that's how we've got to 49, including 6 great-grandchildren now. So those default positions existed for a long while. Lewis puts it like this in at the Abolition of Man. He says, for the wise men of old, meaning the medievals, the cardinal problem of human life was how to conform your soul to objective reality. That's it, objective reality. And it's not measured. He's talking about men before we got to reductionism. And he says the solution was wisdom and self-discipline and virtue. Those are things that are largely absent from the life of the modern young. A little bit of self-discipline in order to pass the exams, but not much, not as a way of life. But then he goes on and he sees what's coming. He thinks it's already there. He says, for the modern man, the cardinal problem of human life is how to conform reality to our desires. And the solution is technique or technology. Is it true? I think it's undeniable, isn't it? That's why in the 60s they went on trips, but not to see things they ought to see, but to get into a world that was exciting but had no consequences, they thought. But of course it destroyed them. Escapism. Human beings have always escaped. I mean, we had our drunkards when I was growing up. Not a lot. Nobody routinely on our street who I saw routinely drunk. But it was a hard life if you were living on less than $20 a week for your family to take. I mean, beer was 70 pennies in those days, but they would, on Friday night, they'd go off to the pub and drink a bit more than they should, so there was slightly less for the week to come than there would otherwise be. Because in our family, there was no alcohol at all, and no television, and no car. We were poor, but I didn't know it, because I was rich. I was loved, I was secure, and I had parents I wish I had the integrity they had. They had a tough childhood, and conversion and Christian marriage gave them a new life which they appreciated. It's still true and can still be true. And when you talk about these things, there will be students who really want to know more. So think about what you can do in this respect. So sadly, in our world, our Christian world at the moment, the gospel has been degraded. It doesn't deal with those big questions. As I said, those questions are not discussed in Christian youth groups very much. The worst degradation, in my view, or one of them, is the prosperity gospel, which, thank God, is falling apart now. But that has done so much damage in Africa. So much damage. I mean, there's been a lot of conversions in Africa, which I have to look upon as genuine, but not enough Christian teaching. I remember the first time I did a student conference in Nigeria. When I got to the location, I discovered to my amazement that students had done the whole thing. They had no help from seniors. They put up a marquee. The first night it wasn't up. They'd put me in a hotel, and they'd found places to sleep. Africans can do that. But the speakers who came in their white Mercedes were doctors who also ran Pentecostal-type churches. And they were preaching the prosperity gospel. So I was a bit of a shock when I said I thought the prosperity gospel was heretical. Jesus said, in this world, you will have suffering. The poor will always be with you. But fear not, I will be with you. Jesus doesn't pretend that this world can be made into a paradise. Quite the opposite. But here we get to the Sermon on the Mount again, of course. What he does is begin with reality. Anybody who thinks that Christianity isn't realistic is out of their mind. Not long ago, an interaction between John Lennox and Peter Singer, the so-called philosopher from Princeton. I once spent a day arguing with him in Wayne State, New York. But he made a great mistake in that he accused John Lennox of having faith as the basis of his life. And he said, were your parents Christian? He said, yes, they were. He said, so you're just believing the family fairy tale? And John Lennox said, were your parents atheists? Yes, so you're believing the family fairy tale too? No, I'm factual. He said, and then he realized, I mean, he'd done it, didn't he? He can't prove the non-existence of God. He has a faith and he hopes desperately that there is no God. But he has no basis for that. In fact, steadily in the scientific area, the evidence for God is growing. If you don't believe me, just listen to Lennox, James Tour, Stephen Meyer, and a few others. But those three would get you over the hump immediately. James Tour, I recently saw a lovely video of him in Harvard with the students. Beautiful. Look it up. What are we going to do about this? We need to look at the reality that Jesus brings in. I mean, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, I can't overemphasize this. He says you have a problem and you're not facing it. The first and most serious problem you face is that you know what you ought to do, but you cannot do it. You are poor in spirit. That's what that aphorism has to be developed in that way. Look at the book of James, basically a commentary on that. Jesus is incredibly realistic about what can happen and what will happen. The Sermon on the Mount lays it out in aphoristic terms, which we've been going through. But at the end of the day, I'm going to jump to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. I'll pick up where we got to on another week, but for this week, I'll go to the end. Because pushing back on a truncated gospel of merely grace in salvation, or even worse, prosperity gospel, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells a story, a parable. And it's the parable that many of you know of the man who builds his house on a rock and the man who builds his house on the sand. And such is our capacity to make things more comfortable that there used to be a little children's story, a song about that, building your house on the rock or on the sand. But it's used as a invitation to conversion. But that's not what it is originally. Jesus is very clear. He says, what shall I liken a man who hears my words, meaning understands my words, and does them? He is a man who builds his house on the rock. And when the troubles of life come along, they will not touch him. He will come through them. But what shall I liken a man who hears my words, understands what I've said, but does not do them? He is the man who builds on the sand. That's frightening, isn't it? What's really frightening is that there are so many Christians who, if only that challenge had been put to them at the right moment, would probably have grasped it when they were young. But by now they've got themselves into all sorts of problems. And it's much harder. But they're not having life to the full, which is what Jesus says comes when you learn to live in obedience to my words. And you live with delayed gratification in many ways, but also much gratification now. That we truly need. So Lewis makes the case in the first chapter of The Abolition of Man that objective values exist. In fact, he came to that conclusion long before he became a Christian. He knew a lot of history, a lot of literature, and he knew that without objective values, if things like love and duty and patriotism, justice, without those, we're merely animals. Animals run on reflexes, and we're running on our feelings, which are not even, they don't even have the utility of reflexes, because our problems are not primarily eating, sleeping, and reproducing. Because we are humans, we have a world beyond the merely material. Hence the question, is it right to call that waterfall beautiful or good? Or is it in fact sublime? Can we learn the rules of art, of literature, of everything, so that we go deeper and understand that we are created, that the world is created? There is a cause for prayer. Maybe it's not surprising that Lewis thinks that Psalm 19 is the most perfect poem ever written, because it begins with the universal human phenomenon of stopping and looking at beautiful things. Sunsets, birds, flowers, the natural world. It is full of glory. Probably Gerard Manley Hopkins does it best. But Lewis understood that, and Psalm 19 does that. The first half is about the world. You look at the world and you see its glory and its wonder. Then in the second half, the most beautiful transition, the two halves fit together beautifully. He moves inwards and he looks at the word of God and what it can do, sweeter than honey and the honeycomb. He can give you life in all its fullness. Beautiful, beautiful example. A psalm that every child should learn if we were using their minds in the way we should, because they can memorize those things with the greatest of ease. Do it. Think of the things that you ought to know by heart, then challenge your children, and they will beat you every time, especially the young ones, the under fives, 6, 7. They can memorize stuff with the greatest of ease. They don't ask why and how, they just learn it. That's what they're made for at that stage. So Lewis has decided way back at the beginning of the Second World War, when he was doing those talks, that objective values must exist if we are to be humans. And if we refuse this, we do become just animals. And our worst criminals, you even hear it said he's behaving like an animal. No, that's an insult to the animals. They don't do gratuitous violence when they're looking for food. They're finding their place in the way the world is made to illustrate to us what we would be like if we were not made also in the image of God. But we're not grateful, are we? We're not grateful at all. And that's where we need to correct ourselves. And that is the greatest source of joy that you can have in your life. Nothing does more for me in terms of tear-producing joy than seeing someone else turn their life around. And if I happen to have a minor role in that, that makes it even more beautiful. But just to be there when it happens. And that's what's changing our world, because amongst all the dross and nonsense that you can find on YouTube, if you did look up that list of people who were Muslim became Christian, it's remarkable what's happening in much of the Muslim world. They very often see Jesus in a dream. That starts them off. My translator in Africa came to me because of a dream from a Muslim background. So I've seen it firsthand. And then it grows. Because it answers the questions. It doesn't make it easier. I mean, I don't believe that Romans 7 is something that was in the past. For me, it's in the present. The good that I know and I would wish to do and every day want to, nevertheless, I usually fail on a daily basis. But Paul goes on and says, what shall I do? Who can help me? And then Romans 8, thanks be to God. There is a way. And again, you often see there another illustration of wanting it on a plate as a gift, which isn't exactly what Jesus does. Let me misquote Romans 8 for those of you who are Christian. It's just to push you a bit harder to take your book more seriously. Paul says, if the Spirit puts to death the deeds of the flesh, you will live. Now, if you're not shaking your head, you need to go and read 7 and 8 and think about it, and perhaps go and find Tom Wright talking about it as well. Here's the correct version. If you, through the Spirit, put to death the deeds of the flesh, you will win. We have agency, what Pascal calls the dignity of causality. And when that agency is meek, then we get to one of the most beautiful phrases in the Anglican prayer book in the morning service that's not much read these days, whose service is perfect freedom. See, the students are told that they're free to do what they wish, but doing what you wish is not good news, as they all know. Paul puts gossip next to murder in terms of its theological content. So the boys tend to be murderous, the girls tend to be vicious in a different way. You can see that in the fact that the girls have 2 or 3 times as much anxiety as the boys at a university level because of inter-girl nastiness and TikTok nonsense. That's where we're at. So, learning how to bend the knee and ask for help and receiving it, that's the way forward. That's what Lewis was talking about in The Abolition of Man, and he takes you through and shows you how these things can be worked out from what we already know. So, there's a doing aspect to it. James is the book to read if you're in denial, in the sense that you say, well, I'm a Christian, I don't have to do anything now. Absolutely wrong. Jesus' parable of the man on the rock and the man in the sand should make you shake in your knees, because he will keep his side of the bargain, but one day he will question you about your life. I'm not looking forward to that interview. But the security of the soul is there, but heaven is not everybody's equal type nonsense. We will all have stories of grace. We'll be equal in that sense. But again, Lewis's Great Divorce has a lot to teach us about that. So I hope this has challenged you. I hope you begin to see, and we'll have a lot more to say about this, that the world of virtue believes that there is a rationality behind what we already know, whose service is perfect freedom. Freedom is not the freedom to do what you wish. It's the freedom by the grace of God to do what you ought. Thank you.